to No Need to Argue, a podcast where we explore the truth as some see it. No Need to Argue is presented in seasons and looks at one topic over the course of 8 episodes. At No Need to Argue, we believe that knowledge stems from discussion where the aim is not victory of one side, but progress in thought for all. My name is Ashley Schlafly, one of your 2 co-hosts that will be with you this season. And tonight, in our second episode, we are going to be looking at the rehabilitation industry. But first, I want to reintroduce my co-host, Tom Schlafly. Tom, how are you doing today?
Hi, Ashley. I'm doing great, and I'm still alive and glad to be here.
Tonight, we are going to be looking at the rehabilitation industry. From medical stopgaps in the form of methadone and Suboxone to centers that promote the ability to get an addict clean, the business of stopping users from using is one that is quite lucrative. There are currently 14,000 plus treatment facilities in the United States, and together they bring in about $35 billion a year. Now, these centers are in addition to the state-run facilities that insurance will typically cover aspects of, but private facilities are paid out of pocket and range from $10,000 to $60,000 per month, which translates to $320 to $1,930 per day. Additionally, addicts that need to go to a sober living facility can expect to spend an additional $3,000 to $10,000 per month following their 30 to 90 day stint in rehab. What do you get for this money? Well, that's debatable. Most facilities do claim a 90% cleanliness and success rate, but many studies report that it's typically closer to a 30% success rate, with only 20 to 30% of addicts completing a 90-day program actually staying clean past the 6-month mark. So with that in mind, tonight we are going to be talking about our own experience with Tom going to rehab and me being a family member sending someone off to a drug rehabilitation center. And from our perspective, what rehabilitation facilities in the industry, including the medical management of addiction, actually look like, and if we found that they're successful at all. Before we get started tonight, we talked a lot about transparency on our first episode. And so I think in order to remain consistent with the message and the perspective that we are trying to just ensure that this podcast has, I think we need to let our listeners know what happened following the recording of our first episode and my cutting it and you listening to it. Do you want to kind of talk about that?
Sure. We got into a big fight last night after recording, and a lot of it had to do with my anxiety about talking about these things so openly. But also, I found it very difficult to work with somebody who is as stubborn as I am. And we seem to butt heads a lot. And we had a lot of disagreements. And it's been very therapeutic, I think, to work through these, doing this podcast. And hopefully we've resolved some of these things. Resolved is the wrong word. Hopefully we've identified some of these things that we can work on in the future. One thing that was very apparent to me was that you still have a lot of anger towards my addiction and using.
Yeah, anger. I think that, you said in the first episode that all family members of addicts should be angry and that you understand why we have anger. And I think that's the thing, like as we talk about rehabs tonight, I think that's the thing that they don't prepare you for. You go into crisis mode when somebody's using, when somebody you love is using. You go into this, we have to save them. And that's why these rehab facilities are so appealing, because they come in and they go, okay, here it is. Here's how you're going to save them. You're going to send them to us and we're going to fix them for you. And we're going to send them home exactly the way that you remember them. Not the way they are now, but the way that they are without drugs. And then you come home and you're clean, but all of those things that happened prior to you going to get clean are still there. It erases the using. It doesn't erase the damage that the using caused. And I think that's where my anger certainly stems from. For the majority of the time when I've been angry at you post-rehab and pre-rehab, it's been mostly centered around our children. And this idea that you would do anything to take, yourself away from your kids, because I've said this to you ad nauseum, I chose to marry you. I knew you were an addict. You weren't in active addiction when I married you, but I knew you were an addict. And I had been in the rooms enough to know that, I don't remember the exact statistic, but it's like 98% of people in the rooms relapse at some point. And so I knew that there was a possibility that that you would relapse. But when it happened, we had a kid, and now we have two kids. And so when I think about your addiction, I think about the fact that I tethered myself to you and they had no choice in the matter. And so my anger mostly stems, it's almost like on their behalf, if that makes any sense.
I remember you talking a lot about how you understood the concept of addiction. And I think that's because you understand the concept of self-loathing. We would go to meetings together in Mississippi quite often. You would see people there that were not clean or newly clean and very out of their minds, essentially. You saw me as somebody different because I had been clean for a while. I know that academically you understood that a lot of addicts relapse, but I don't think you were ever prepared for my relapse after we got married.
I mean, that's categorically true. I had no idea that you were going to relapse. And I think that you make a good point about understanding, you make fun of me for being, quote unquote, these are your words, an academic, right? An intellectual, whatever you want to call it, somebody who overanalyzes things. That's what I am. And so that was very difficult for me because I could understand what addiction was on paper. I could understand what it was. I could understand what it was from my experience in the rooms, my personal experience, seeing what people were going through and seeing what they look like. And it was compartmentalization. It was, okay, well, these are addicts, and then there's Tom. These are what addicts look like, and then there's Tom. Because I just never saw you as your addiction. I didn't realize what your addiction was going to do. And, we were going to talk about rehab, but with that in mind, you have relapsed and not gone to rehab, and then you relapsed and did go to rehab. And both relapses were the same. They look the same. You had to kick, you had to get off the drugs, you had to do all of that. And they were really frightening. And I remember the first time you relapsed and we went to that horrible doctor that we shared about on the first episode, you came home and I went into planning mode. That's what I do. I need to fix things. I need to figure out what to do to fix it. And so as a quote unquote academic, I lied and went to all of these treatment places and lied and said I was an addict so that I could get behind that firewall, behind the wall of what they put up for people who are not part of that community. And so I could talk to the therapist there and said, okay, what do I do? How do I get him clean? What do I do about this? How do I know he's using? What does using look like? Because I didn't know any of those things. And I didn't have time to be angry then. I had time to be angry when you came home.
Yeah. And that was a whole process that took about a year. And I think during that time you got pregnant, right? With our first son, from the time of my first relapse to going to rehab.
You were on Suboxone, which for those of you who do not know is how would you describe it? An opioid replacement?
It's a opioid replacement therapy, a maintenance therapy that is a whole subject in itself, along with methadone to discuss. But basically, I had relapsed and was shooting heroin. I admitted to my wife one night that I had relapsed and that I was going to lose my job if I did not get on Suboxone. And I don't know how much you knew about Suboxone, but I remember vividly going to the clinic the first time, which was not in the best neighborhood. But can you tell me what you remember about that?
Well, for me, Suboxone was our first rehab option. What I have learned is that the rehabilitation industry, the rehabilitation complex, it exists beyond just a building where people go to quote unquote get clean. There's also these maintenance meds that are a rehab in and of itself that I knew about methadone, but I did not know about Suboxone. And I remember going to the clinic, and I remember that guy tried to sell us, I don't remember if it was heroin or crack, but he tried to sell us something in the parking lot. And my southern side came out, and I was very polite to him. I was like, oh, no, thank you. Like he had offered us, a lollipop. And I remember going into the clinic, and what I was most surprised by was how easy it was to get and how much they gave you. They gave you a tremendous amount. And for those of you who don't know, Suboxone is very, very strong. Its half-life is very, very long, which we'll get into in a second when we talk about detox, what half-lives are. But, its half-life is very long. It's a very powerful drug. And in many ways, it's more, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's even more powerful than heroin in a lot of ways.
Well, it's more therapeutic than heroin. It has legitimate therapeutic uses. And I'm sure we'll talk about this in other episodes, but medication-assisted treatment, it's statistically proven that it's more effective than abstinence. I was on methadone. I went to a methadone clinic for 7 years in St. Louis from about 2003 to 2010. And I went every day. I put a lot of thought into the benefits and drawbacks of a medication like that. Most people who don't do drugs don't understand what these drugs are. So it is possible to use them therapeutically, to use them to not use drugs, to use them to not get high, to use them to taper off, and hopefully find therapy, a lifestyle that they need to stay clean. In my experience, most of the patients at the methadone clinic didn't achieve that. In my experience, it was a little bit like prison. You go in there and they teach you how to be a better criminal. I met lots of phenomenal drug resources there. But I do think that it did save my life, even though I was miserable for 7 years, because I still used heroin during that time, but it was intermittently. I decided not to go to the clinic some days, and I would shoot up heroin. Had I been shooting heroin every day for those 7 years, I'm quite sure I wouldn't be around today.
Well, you asked what I remembered. Other than remembering how easy it was for you to get, I remember the guy wanted to give you a lot more than what you asked for. You asked for a certain dosage because you've always been very apt at dosing. You're a very responsible drug user. And so you know how much you can take. And he wanted to give you like double that dose. And I was really surprised by that. And then the final thing I'll say is that, rehabs promise an immediate change where you go back to the person you were. And Suboxone did that. You were in withdrawals when we got to the clinic. They gave you a dose. It was a little film. It looks like a Listerine breath strip. You put it on your tongue, and within 5 minutes, you were Tom again. You were normal. You weren't high. You were you. And I remember thinking, oh, okay, this is it. This is the solution. And it unfortunately is a lie in and of itself too, though, because you were in a lot of pain on that drug, because every morning you would wake up in withdrawals every morning and you would have to take it again. And so you were still a slave to your addiction. It just had changed. You weren't shooting up anymore, but you were satiating that need. And you talked about how I got pregnant with our son right after that. You got a really big new job. I got pregnant with our son. You're on Suboxone, and you decided that you needed to come off the Suboxone because you had it in your head. You convinced yourself that you weren't going to be a good father if you were on any chemical, and coming off of it is what led you to relapse the second time when I was 7 months pregnant. And you talked about anger. I mean, as you know, that's where a lot of my anger stems, because My pregnancy was very, very difficult with our son because I took care of you that entire pregnancy. I watched you kick. I sat up and held you in a bathtub as you screamed from withdrawals. It was horrible. And so when you talk about anger and anger that gets expressed both in rehab and afterwards, that's for me personally where a lot of that anger stems.
That makes a lot of sense because I was angry at myself too. I just want to make a distinction. The medically assisted treatment options like methadone and Suboxone are, like Ashley said, readily available. They're very easily available. I remember the first time I went into a methadone clinic and they just did a quick urine test to see if you had any opioids in your system. And I remember, the doctor telling me that this was the gold standard of treatment for opiate addiction. I'm very cynical and sarcastic, and I had a bunch of thoughts in my head like, if this is the gold standard, what the fuck have you guys been doing in modern medicine for the last 100 years? Because, they had 100 people lined out the door, at 5 a.m. to get their dose, and I had to go every day. It was miserable. It's just my opinion, but yeah, they over-medicated you. They would rather you stay on that medicine for the rest of your life than not go back and use drugs. And I think that I understand that argument because when you go out and shoot heroin, you could die at any time, especially today. But also, it just felt very hopeless that there was no other option. Was always wary of the doses I was given because I knew how hard it was to get off these drugs. There's a stigma against methadone and Suboxone because people consider them replacement drugs, replacing one drug for another, replacing one addiction for another. If you use them right, you can stabilize your life and hold down a job. And I remember going to that Suboxone clinic with the intent on keeping my job. Right. They prescribed me 8 milligrams and I knew I only needed 2 really. But I remember I had an accounting test that night. And I remember you were crying in the office. You were like, when is he going to feel better? Because I was in really bad withdrawal. And the doctor said, well, he'll feel better really quickly. And by that night, I was at the university taking that test. And
God, I forgot you were doing the school thing again. Then I totally blocked that out. My problem with the maintenance meds, though, as somebody who watched you go through it, is I have watched you come off of heroin. I have watched you come off of meth. I have watched you come off of ketamine. And I've watched you come off of Suboxone. And you coming off of Suboxone was the hardest kick that you made. And so, you're talking about how they give it to you to save your life, but maybe I'm just cynical, but I think it's to trap you. It's money. It's money that they get because you had to go and pay, not just for the medication, which was incredibly expensive. It was about $500 a month, your Suboxone habit or your Suboxone cure, whatever you want to call it. Insurance didn't cover it. So we paid $500 a month and you had to pay, it was like $120 each time you saw the doctor. So it was a $620 a month bill that our family was on the hook for you to be rehabilitated. And in truth, you weren't rehabilitated because you were still dependent on something. And it gave you back to me, but it gave you back to me shackled in a different way. It put a nicer face on it. And there were other options, which was for you to go get treated because things got really bad after our son was born. You started using needles again after our son was born. And you had come off of the Suboxone. You'd taken yourself off of it without talking to me. You gotten addicted to fentanyl because you were using fentanyl patches to get off of the Suboxone. And then you started using heroin again. And it wasn't a cure. It didn't fix it. It was an expensive way to keep you using is what I felt. And that's where we found ourselves in April of 2016, because you went on the Suboxone in April of 2015. And then you were having a conversation with me and your mother in April of 2016 about going to a rehab. So I don't feel like it was worth that money.
I think we're going to talk about the movie Train Spotting later on. Is that correct?
Yes, in our final episode.
And I hope we get to play this clip of the main character preparing for withdrawal. But it is a very regimented process, and apparently I'm not the only one who does it. So I had decided that Suboxone it's great for maintenance, and it's great to keep your job. It is very painful to get off of because the withdrawals last so long. So to me, this is perfectly logical. I decided that since Suboxone had a withdrawal of, 36 hours, similar to, methadone. It's slightly shorter than methadone, actually. But I would get on an opiate that had a shorter half-life. The withdrawals are more painful, but they last less. And because I was gainfully employed, I would like to miss less time at work. So I thought I would just take more pain in less time rather than the same amount of pain over more time. To me, it was a zero-sum game. So I ordered a bunch of fentanyl off the dark net. It was not patches. It was powder. I prepared it with chemical gloves and a milligram scale in a nasal solution so I could carry it on airplanes and use it in front of my mother and you without you knowing. And I used it for about 6 weeks, transferring off Suboxone. I procured a bunch of other drugs as well for the detox process. This is very, very common. I had Valium and Xanax and GHB and ketamine.
Kratom.
Oh, yeah, Kratom. Although I really never found a palatable way to ingest that. All sorts of things. Paracetamol. It was like Hunter S. Thompson.
Well, I think what you're bringing up is a lot of the question of non-addicts or people who don't have loved ones that are addicts. They go, well, why don't they just go to treatment? Why don't they just go to treatment? And one of the biggest barriers to going to treatment is that you're afraid of the withdrawals. You're terrified of them. And I remember I didn't understand that until I watched you kick for the first time. I watched you kick for the first time in April of 2015. April of 2015. We put an air mattress out in the living room and I couldn't even sit next to you because they call it the kicks for a reason. I mean, you literally were kicking, you were climbing the walls. And then in 2015, November 2015, worst Thanksgiving I ever had, when you were coming off the fentanyl, you were in the bathtub and you were just begging me to hold you and screaming, make it stop. You got to make it stop. Just let's just go score one more time. We make it stop. Just make it stop. And I understood why you didn't want to go. And so fast forward to April of 2016, you're about to go to rehab, and the biggest convincing was to get you to go to detox ahead of time. Because if you're listening and you don't understand how all this works, rehab facilities by and large do not have detox facilities within them. So you actually have to go to 2 different facilities. You go first to a detox facility, which typically costs between $5,000 to $15,000 on its own. And that detox facility keeps you for anywhere between 5 days to 2 weeks. And then you go to the actual rehabilitation center. So when you're trying to determine where you're going to send your loved one to a physical rehab, your first step is to figure out detox. And we in 2016 sent you to a detox in Hill Country here in Texas. It was a nice facility that you went to. It was not one of the state-run places. But could you talk a little bit about why you were so afraid, not just from the withdrawals itself, but what detox itself is like?
Right. I've tried to detox myself many times, and typically I tend to make the mistake of over-medicating myself. So in 2015, there's a big difference between detox and rehab, and oftentimes they are 2 separate institutions. The first institution I went to was in 2010 in Mississippi, and they were sort of associated with each other pretty closely. So I went to the detox, and it was just the most, it still is. Yeah, Ashley can talk about the bathtub all she wants. It certainly was terrible withdrawing in there. But with the detox, I was totally without any control. And I don't feel like, and this was a decent place because I know they charged, over $10,000 for 7 days of detox. I didn't even get a fucking IV. I didn't feel like I received any medical care. I mean, they came in and checked on me once a day, and I was literally kicking the walls and screaming and crying. And we'll talk about that in later episodes. But the crying depicted in certain films about drugs is what I find the most authentic part, because I've done so much crying when using, well, I should say when withdrawing, but also when using, that it was just one of the most horrible experiences. I left that detox after 8 days and weighed 127 pounds, and I'm 6'2".
I mean, you're almost 6'3". Yeah. I mean, you were tiny. We're going to share on Twitter. We should share on Twitter that picture of you and how thin you are, and, put like a side by side, like Tom on drugs, Tom off drugs, like that promotion. This is your brain on drugs. This is Tom off drugs.
Yeah. Now I'm fucking fat.
That's for another podcast. But, well, what I think is so horrible about detox is that, as a family member, because I've certainly never been inside of a detox facility, but, they wouldn't let me speak to you when you were in detox. I wasn't allowed to talk to you. So I dropped you off at detox, and you begged me not to leave you there. It was awful. We were sitting outside, in the parking lot, and you just went to pieces because you realized, because it was about a 3.5 hour drive from our house. And we finally got there, and you just went to pieces. And I knew what I was, because I'd watched you withdraw. I knew what I was walking you into. And that was so difficult. Although I will say, the place we sent you, there was that great guy, although he had a huge crush on me, and that's why he called me so much. But he would like text me, and he would call me and be like, "Hey, your husband's fine." I would get texts all the time from him. And then he would ask me questions about, my life.
Fuck.
That you read them all when you got home, and you were super pissed, but you're like, I'm fucking hallucinating in here. But, and he's macking on you, but he was very nice. And because of that, I played that up so that I kept getting, phone calls about you, because I didn't get to, you were there 5 days. So I didn't get to speak to you for those, 5 days. And then the other thing I'll say is, I think another thing that non-addicts don't understand is that the reason why it's so hard to kick at home is because if you use once, all that pain goes away. It's an immediate fix. So imagine, I just had the flu. I just recovered from the flu, and I would have given anything, as bad as I felt, to take a pill and just automatically feel better. And that's what withdrawals are.
That's how I've always explained it to you, is that when you're in such pain, like the flu, and it's several degrees greater than a typical flu, but if you have the opportunity or ability to take something that will make you feel better in 5 minutes, I don't know who would not do it. With regards to that rehab guy, well, first I want to say that there are different types of detoxes. There's hospital detoxes. Typically alcoholics, I think, are put in them because they're very prone to seizures. It can be very deadly. If you're a heroin addict, no matter how much it hurts, you're not in danger of having a seizure. I always did benzodiazepines and heroin. Benzodiazepines are like alcohol and can cause seizures. I just felt like I never received the appropriate amount of medical care or, I guess, check-ins. I remember being with somebody in this detox in 2016 who had been going to Mexico because Xanax is very plentiful there if you have enough money, and the pharmacist will just sell it to you. And he had been doing 60 milligrams of Xanax a day, which is quite a deadly amount. He had a seizure in the kitchen of our little detox house and passed out and hit his head and was bleeding all over the floor. So, those of us in other kinds of withdrawal had to run and, notify this guy. I guess Ashley was busy texting. He was carted out in an ambulance. And obviously, if you're in a hospital for alcohol withdrawal, I think they take a little bit better care of you. But I remember my father telling me during his residency, he would watch people go through alcohol withdrawal, and, he would hold up 3 fingers and ask them how many fingers they saw. And they said 5. And he said, good, you're good to go. That's what he was taught to do. The treatment of withdrawal and addiction is utterly subpar, in my opinion. And that's why I'm so scared. I would rather do ketamine and GHB in my bathtub than have to go through that.
What is GHB? Is that the date rape drug?
Well, I never used it to date rape, but yes, it's very fun.
You roofied yourself.
Right, I roofied myself, yeah.
The things you learn. Okay, so you get out of detox and you actually go to rehab. And the rehab you went to in Mississippi was beautiful and nice, but I don't think it was anywhere near as nice as the second place you went, the place that you went in 2016. And I remember being a little miffed when I came to visit you because it was weird. Family week was randomly the first weekend that you got there. Typically you go to family week at the end, but we got there on a weird schedule. So I wound up coming to family week that first weekend. And for those of you who don't know, family week is where you come and you visit your family that's in rehab, and they put you through these horrendous team building and relationship building exercises, which we'll talk about in just a second. But before we get into family week, could you talk a little bit about what the day-to-day in rehab is like?
Sure. Can I just tell one more anecdote about detox?
Yeah, of course.
You and I were allowed to talk to each other in detox, but only for I talked to you for maybe 5 minutes on the phone twice, maybe.
I genuinely don't remember that.
Oh, that's fine. But that guy who was texting you let me talk to you.
Detox John.
Oh, Detox John. And I remember you saying that you were texting him and trying to, find out how I was doing. You were very worried about me, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if you mentioned it or in passing or whatever, but you were like, I've been texting them. I was doing a lot of methamphetamine at the time, and I had never had meth hallucinations before. But that night I woke up in the middle of the night and I had to go to the bathroom, and I went in there and I saw Detox John in the bath. There were bubbles in the bath, and he asked me if I wanted to get in. And at that point I realized I was hallucinating, and I thought, oh my God, I've really fucked myself up on meth here.
Strangely, I had the same hallucination. No, I'm joking. I'm totally joking.
The day-to-day of rehab, I think, is pretty much the same the world over, whether it's a Medicaid rehab or the place Lindsay Lohan went. What was it?
Passages.
Yes, right. I think the only difference is the quality of the food and the Egyptian cotton sheets that Lindsay Lohan enjoyed. I didn't have Egyptian cotton sheets, but they weren't bad. The place I went to in Mississippi was certainly not bad either. And it was actually, I think in the first episode, I talked about how it was a 90-day facility, my first facility, a 12-step 90-day facility. This second place was a 30-day facility.
Well, with the option of staying for 90.
Well, sure, they would take your money for as long as you wanted to stay there, certainly. But I ended up staying for 30 days.
You go to counseling sessions, you go to individual counseling sessions, group counseling sessions, you watch movies about addiction, that Russell Brand film that I had to watch with you. You watch all of these things, but rehab is all about getting you away from drugs long enough to rework your brain so you don't use when you go out, to teach you coping mechanisms. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. Both rehabs I've been in were the same. There was group therapy, individual therapy. Both times I went to rehab, the individual therapists were good. The first time one had her PhD, and the second time one was just she was completing her work as a master's as a social worker, but she was very good too. I think she had an innate talent to do the work, whether she had the experience or not. The group sessions were what most annoyed me, and they were what took up most of my day, because I had to listen to a bunch of people who just didn't want to be there. I remember crying on my therapist couch there in 2016 because they always ask you this question. They have the same set of questions, it seems, at every rehab when you come in. It's like, why do you want to be here? And I said, well, I really want to get clean. I just honestly don't know if I can. I said, I know I can stay clean here for 30 or 60 or 90 days. At that point, I didn't know how long I was going to be there. But I said, if I'm being honest, I really am scared about not being able to do this long term, because I was clean for 5 years and I failed.
Well, let's talk about Family Week, because Family Week was very hard for me. You talked at the beginning about anger. I was raised in a household with a very Southern mother. I'm from New Orleans, very Southern mom who we were not taught to show our true emotions. We were taught that if something was wrong, you pretended like it wasn't. That was, you don't let other people see your problems. And I've had lots of issues as a result of that. But Family Week for me in my adulthood is one of the biggest examples of how that failed me. Because what happened at the Family Week I went to was we were in a room with all these other families, and a lot of these people were pissed. I mean, they were angry. Everybody was angry. And we went through all these exercises where we were supposed to share how angry we were. And I remember feeling these pangs of anger, but going, oh no, I mean, I can't embarrass Tom in this way. I can't sit in here and tell these stories. And the one memory I want to kind of get your perspective on, I'll tell you mine, and then I'm curious because we actually haven't talked about this, I don't think, since it happened. But we were put through an exercise where we had to sit in chairs facing one another in the middle of the room. And I was given a list of sentence prompts. So I feel ashamed when, I feel angry when, and I was supposed to fill in the blanks, and you were supposed to just sit and listen, which I had problems with that as a therapeutic practice to begin with. But I remember listening to the other people that went, and they were saying stuff like, I felt ashamed when you fucked my best friend in the living room and I walked in and saw you, like things like that. And I didn't have things like that. So I remember that specific one. I said, I'm ashamed of you never. I'm never ashamed of you. And I'm angry that you used, or, these really generic answers to get an A on the assignment to quote unquote win therapy. But I wasn't honest. And I'm just curious if you knew at the time that I wasn't being honest, and kind of what you think about that practice at Family Week because everything's so raw at that point.
I appreciate you not being honest because it made it easier and less embarrassing. But I think I knew obviously on some level that you weren't being completely honest, but you did tell an anecdote about me on heroin accidentally knocking over my son out of his, what do you call it?
His little bassinet.
Yeah. I remember you telling me that. And I mean, that story was enough to let me know how angry you were. And honestly, I don't really remember the incident. And I've told my therapist many times, because you've brought it up in therapy many times, that story. But I remember saying to her many times, I don't remember that specifically, but I'm sure it's true. She's not lying about it. I think that, I mean, it's really hard to deal with a whole circle of addicts and get to their root family issues, root causes of using in a couple of days. I think ours lasted a couple of days. It was exhausting, but it's just simply impossible to get to. And I think that that's where individual marriage or family therapy on a long-term basis really has value. Unfortunately, it's very expensive.
Well, I think that you bring up a good point, which is I think the biggest fallacy of a family week is that it's done in a week. It's my problem with rehabs in general. And please know that this is not a podcast where we're saying this is right and that is wrong. We're just expressing our own experience, our own opinions, because that's what they are. They're not fact. They very much are opinions based on our own very unique experience. But my unique experience and opinion about rehabs is that they're sold as a catch-all, the same way that Suboxone is sold as a catch-all, that there's one way to get people clean. And what it doesn't take into account is exactly what you said. They're all addicts are the same in many ways, but the reason they use is different. Again, full transparency, Tom and I have been in therapy for 3 years now. Since he got back from rehab, we are in individual therapy and we go to therapy together because we are both committed to the fact that recovery for him and recovery for me as someone that is with an addict, that recovery as a couple is a lifelong recovery. It doesn't stop at the end of rehab. And we are fortunate enough to have the resources to maintain that. But that's why, my opinion, a lot of rehabs are not successful is because 30, 60, 90 days, one and done, there's a reason that doesn't work.
There's definitely people who come out of rehab and develop a program, a lifestyle that allows them to stop using drugs. For me, it was leaving rehab and going to what's called a sober living facility for a year, which is basically, there's many different kinds of sober living facilities. Mine was very informal. It was basically an apartment that was rented next to the rehab complex, and a group meeting every day, and we were required to go to 12-step meetings every day, and they would drug test us. And looking back on it, I didn't particularly enjoy it day to day necessarily, but I think it really helped me stay clean for 4.5 years. Whether you're talking about rehabs or a drug dealer on a street corner or pharmaceutical companies, Suboxone clinics, they're all businesses. They all have a bottom line. Their ultimate motive is profit. In my experience, except for the pharmaceutical companies, which I think are completely corrupt, the people that treated me at rehab they genuinely cared about their patients and their job. It really helped me. Was it worth $1,000 a day? I don't think so, but they helped me. Sober living helped me. For a lot of people who don't have access to expensive rehabs, there are state rehabs available. And 12 steps, which I attended for many years, is also an option. And it helped, it helped me. I have my own opinions about it, but it's helped me and many other millions of people.
Well, 12-step programs are actually going to be in our next episode because those are options that are free. And we're going to talk about kind of like a comparable, the comparable effect on clean time that a rehab versus a 12-step program is, does one work better than the other? But just wanted to say a couple of things to that. Commonality brings people into the rooms of NA. Commonality brings people into the rooms of AA. And it brings them to rehab centers. But treating people in this ubiquitous way, I just think it's not like if you get cancer. If you get one type of cancer, they don't treat everybody the same way. Everybody has their own individualized treatment plan. And that doesn't happen as often as it should or on as deep of a level, in my opinion, as it should in rehabs. I mean, I shared in the first episode that I have an eating disorder. I sought treatment for my eating disorder in my early 20s because I was out of control with it. I mean, I couldn't stop restricting my food, much in the same way that you couldn't stop using drugs. And I remember the therapists that I met, them not understanding that I was different. I didn't feel like I was a person. I felt like I was a disorder. And that's the problem, is that, for people to really get clean, you have to treat the person, not their disorder. It doesn't matter what your drug of choice was. It doesn't matter the way that I restricted my food and the methods that I used to do so. What matters is how best do we get those people to stop doing these destructive behaviors. So I did the math, and between your family and us personally, we've spent upwards of $250,000 on getting you clean. Not the amount you've spent on drugs, which equals that, I'm sure, but in getting you clean. And so I want to pose a question to you. I want to share this analogy. You said once that you would know it was time to go to treatment because using is like a merry-go-round. So you're on the merry-go-round and it's fun and it feels good for a while. And then it starts to spin faster and faster and faster and faster until everything's a blur. And when everything was a blur and you couldn't make out anything anymore and you couldn't figure out how to get off and how to make it stop, that was when it was time to go to treatment. So let's say hypothetically, you climb back on that merry-go-round and it spins too fast. Would you go to treatment? Why or why not?
I really like that analogy. And what people who are not addicts don't understand is once you've been on the merry-go-round and go to treatment and get off, they don't understand why you decide to get back on the merry-go-round, why you decide to let it start spinning, why you decide to notice it going faster and decide that it's not spinning fast enough yet to do anything. One reason, logically, has been the cost of it, the cost benefit. I mean, I'm in finance. I do cost benefit analysis. Obviously, in those instances in my life, when I'm shooting up heroin in front of my mother in the bathroom, telling her to go fuck herself. I mean, obviously I'm in denial and I'm crazy. I need to go to rehab. Other points in my life, I knew I was in trouble and could not justify the cost. And Ashley, you're correct. We've spent maybe $250,000 on rehabs and I've spent over $400,000 on drugs. So, I mean, at this point, we could be living in Boca Raton, but I know you said you'd never live in Florida because of climate change, right?
Oh, well, climate change and I mean, we'll just leave it at climate change. We don't want to offend any of the Floridian listeners out there, but yes, climate change makes me very nervous. But yeah, I think that right there, I think is an important point is the cost and the cost benefit. And the last thing I want us to unpack here is we began by talking about anger, and you shared that story that I was so upset with you about where you knocked Finn, our son's bassinet, over. And I remember when that happened, and I remember how angry I was at you. And I have brought it up ad nauseum, which I apologize in therapy. But I think it's because it isn't so much the incident as much as it is a placeholder for all the other fears I have about our children and a placeholder for all of my anger. It's in that one experience. And I didn't feel any of that anger until you came home. That is what rehabs really don't prepare you for. Is I remember picking you up and I was so excited to see you. And I made you, do you remember I made you that crown that had the don't use drugs on it that I made you wear the whole ride home? And so I was so excited. And then as we got closer to our house here in Houston, I got sick to my stomach because I knew you were back. And all of a sudden, all I wanted was to drive you back to rehab because I realized that you were now back and going to have to stay clean and how hard that was going to be. So I just wanted to know if maybe you could talk about what it's like to come home from rehab and how you feel about my opinion, which is that the true rehab begins once you're clean and home, and the rest of it is all just a really expensive vacation.
The true recovery does begin at home. And that's what I would like any parent of a child who's suffering from drug addiction to know, is that you can send them someplace for 30 days or 60 days or 90 days and sober living, but there was a lot more work entailed after that. And I remember you being so angry with me one night, and I was trying to get you to express your anger. You were telling me all these things about what I had done wrong, and I was saying, good, tell me more. you know, I feel like shit, but keep talking about it because you need to talk about it. I had started therapy at that point in 2016. I'm still in therapy. I go every week. Addiction it affects everybody. I remember one time we got into a big fight, driving in the car home from my in-laws. And, I told you to go get your own therapist because I thought you needed to work out some of that anger.
And I did, and it's added to our bill for sure. But yeah, well, and we would be really interested to hear your opinions on all of this. Everybody's addiction story is different. Everybody's experience loving an addict is different. And when we get into the 12-step meetings in the next episode, we're going to kind of unpack some of that. But we would love to hear from you on Twitter. Please follow us at @NoNeedPod and feel free to post on the page itself or send us a DM so that we can kind of, build a community, because that's what addicts are. Addicts and those that love them are a community. And we're going to get into that next week. But we would love to speak with you more about this and hear your opinions, and hopefully that it's been successful for some of you out there, because it hasn't been very successful for our family, but hopefully it has been for some of you out there. Tom, anything else that you want to add before we wrap up this episode?
I'm glad I went to rehab, especially in 2010, because I was clean for 4.5 years before I relapsed. It gave me a lot of good tools to handle my anxiety, my inferiority complex, my depression. It also moved me geographically to a different state where I ended up meeting you.
Yeah, maybe that's the best part of rehab is that we found each other, because I am glad about that for sure. Even with all the anger, even with all the worry and the pain that has come with your addiction, like I said in the first episode, you are not your addiction. We as a couple are not your addiction. And I think we have a gift more than a curse, because most people get married or enter into long-term domestic partnerships and they're not ever really sure if they love each other until they're tested. And a lot of people fail those tests. And I joke all the time that we've been forged and, in fire, that we're like steel at this point. And what has come out of the rehab stays and what has come out of all the therapy is that we know categorically how much we care about one another and how much we're committed to being together in spite of your addiction and despite your addiction. And I think that we're really lucky in that regard. And no rehab could have given us that. So that is going to wrap up this episode of No Need to Argue. As we shared just a minute ago, please follow us on Twitter at @NoNeedPod. Our personal Twitters are at Ashley Schlafly, and for Tom, at Tom_Schlafly. Additionally, make sure you hit that subscribe button on whatever podcast app you are using. And if you would be so kind, please leave us a 5-star review. That is how we help our podcast grow. We have many plans for additional seasons of this show, and we would love to be able to bring those to you, but we have to build our audience in order to do so. So please leave us that review so we can get that audience growing that is listening in and that we're having these, what we feel are really important conversations with. Our next episode is going to be looking at 12-step programs as well as non-12-step programs and what the rooms of Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous look like for those that decide to enter them. Until then, though, thank you for joining us here at No Need to Argue.